I'm very excited that I get to have this conversation with Karl Chen. Karl is the founder of RYSE Professional Asian Network, one of the largest Asian professional development and networking communities in North America. They have been invited to speak at a multitude of panels regarding diversity and equity, including at Facebook, Women in Business, and Association of Asian Healthcare Leaders. Karl worked as an advisor to politicians and C-suite leaders to support the implementation of campaign direction and policy implementation for underdeserved communities. Karl is passionate about breaking down barriers and uplifting marginalized communities through community building and storytelling. On this talk, we're going to tackle reactive activism and how companies can shift from reactive to proactive activism. So, Karl, welcome. Thank you for being here. How are you today?
Hey, Hunter. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm super excited to share what we have to talk about today and just really glad to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here and thank you for making the time. So before we jump into the questions, Karl, maybe you can give us a little bit about your background as a Chinese Canadian person who, the issues of that we're going to jump into and how activism is important for organizations and their leaders. And you can speak from your experience as a Chinese Canadian person.
Of course. But before that, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Really happy to be here again. So yeah, as mentioned, I was born and raised in Taiwan, and I moved to Canada when I was 10. And I think just in general, I've always, because of my own personal intersecting identities, I've always really focused on uplifting underserved communities and oppressed communities. So those include Indigenous communities, POC communities, neurodivergent, disabled, and queer communities. And so my background really informed and educated myself. And I think in a way, a lot of my identities are, those of marginalized, but I see that as almost in a privilege in a different sense, because I get to see the world through a lens that most people don't get to, especially growing up in North America. It's very, white-centric, like male-centric, and just having that extra lens really help inform and educate my decisions and how I view things. I think everything that we're going to talk about is so important and relevant to organizations and leaders, really just because of the people, right? If you think about it, organizations are made up of people, and people are made up of their experiences. And all your employees and all your coworkers, everyone, we all have lives outside of work. It's not like when we go into work, we just like shed off all the different parts of us, become a robot and work from 9 to 5 and just go there. And when you really think about it, what is a organization or a company's role in activism? A lot of folks I've talked to, they said, like at the end of the day, we're just here to make money. If that is your goal, then sure. Like, I don't know if I can't teach empathy to someone. I think that's something that you can't really learn. You just have to experience it a lot. But also there's a lot of, financial benefits, I guess, to being inclusive. As a lot of research has shown that the younger generations that are coming up, the folks that are gaining that purchasing power, so many of them are looking at these companies and really looking at their corporate social responsibility and how they interact with the communities and deciding where they want to spend their money. So there's that angle as well.
Thank you for that, Karl. So let's jump in with, you can talk, first off, maybe you can share with us about RYSE Network. Tell us what that is and how that came about, perhaps, and the ways that our audiences can learn more about what it is that you do.
Awesome. Yeah, so RYSE Network, we started, I want to say in 2018 November. There was a need in this and on social media as we move towards a more social media based like society and whatnot. There was definitely a need. There wasn't a lot of representations, especially in the workforce where most of us spend most of our time. A lot of companies boast that they have 50% like POC rate or whatever, but most of those are in the lower administrative level. Not a lot of them are in managerial positions or whatnot. So a couple friends and I together, we just, wanted to, we formed a small Facebook group to begin with, just like, hey, like, let's share salaries, make sure that like folks are being fairly compensated, all that sort of stuff. And it grew and grew. And I think we are almost at, I want to say 64,000 members on our Facebook group. Our mission is to advance and empower Asians and other marginalized groups through advocacy and education together as a community. Our community is, I want to say 99% people of color, and those who aren't people of color in our community, I made it very clear, and they all are wonderful, and they know that when they come into our space, they're here to give opportunities and not take opportunities away from other people. And I'm sure there's going to be links dropped in the chat or something later where folks can find us.
Yes, we will drop those in the chat. Our magical team at Power to Fly is doing all these multitasking things for us, so please do drop those in. It sounds like it's really wonderful to hear about, you saw there was a need and then you went to fill that need. And can you talk about, so this topic of proactive activism versus reactive activism. Can we just start by defining what these things are and then talk about why proactive activism is preferable?
Of course. And to preface all of this, I think all forms of activism are reactive because you can't anticipate a problem, right? If you don't know there's a problem, there's nothing you can do about it. So on a very technical basis, all forms of activism are reactive. However, further into that, I think how I personally define reactive versus proactive is what you do with it. So a really good example would be, in the United States, since COVID, there has been a huge uprising in anti-Asian racism, attacks on Asian folks, especially the elderly, the most vulnerable, the most defenseless, which is horrendous. And something that I've seen a lot is GoFundMe, right? Like folks like paying for their medical bills and all that sort of stuff. And that's really great. By no means am I saying that reactive is bad. Folks are reacting to something terrible that happened and they support that person. However, I think something that is even better is cutting it off at its root. So something that we at RYSE did at the beginning of the pandemic is that we formed the Asian Unification Project. Across Canada, we had over 100 volunteers. We had a form that was translated into 7 different Asian languages. And what we did was we got these 100 volunteers to support the elderly, immunocompromised, and disabled folks with daily tasks like getting groceries or running errands, sending mail or whatever, just to eliminate the contact the chances they have to experience hate crime or things like that, right? So to me, that is an example of proactive activism. I think the reason most folks tend to go, on an individual level at least, tend to go towards reactive is because one, time and commitment, of course, right? And also that level of satisfaction that people get. Because let's think about this for a second, right? Someone was injured, someone's in the hospital, you give them money. You've directly supported a person who something has already happened and needs support, right? Those like happy hormones in your brain just like fire off, like, and a lot of folks, like, that's the end of it to them. They just like, okay, I'm done. I did my part. I supported them. But let's think about it from a different way. What if you do something like, the AUP project that we did? You help someone go out and get groceries and bring them home. You're an able-bodied person that isn't likely to be attacked or hate crimed or anything like that, right? I found that has brought folks a lot less satisfaction just in terms of they don't know if they've actually prevented a hate crime from happening. Sure, that elderly person could have totally gone out and like not be attacked and had a perfectly happy shopping trip or whatnot. You don't know if you actually did anything. And that actually also requires more time and effort. It's a lot harder than spending money as well. But, if it were me, I'd rather someone help me do something to prevent me from being attacked or whatever than have someone help me pay for my hospital bills.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting to hear about, you're saying how we're living in a more social media based world. And that is also related to our addiction to dopamine, like oh, I like this thing, this quick fix that we get, and how that's kind of tied to as well of helping other people. Mm-hmm. So, but in the long term, it might not feel as good for me to help in that quick moment, but I'm actually can help someone in a much bigger way, but I have to put in the time, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it sounds like, shocking. I have to make it less about me.
And so, I think that's exactly, where companies step in, right? Because companies, I think there's this misconception of what activism is in a corporate level, at least, right? And something that I also want to put out there is, we talk about, May being AAPI Heritage Month and all that good stuff, but do companies really know what that mean? And, I'm going to be honest right now, most folks I talk to, they say, yay, AAPI month. They understand the AA part. Do they understand the Pacific Islander part? A lot of folks don't even know what that stands for. When I say Pacific Islander, do people know what that is, where that is, right? So a lot of people, and this includes a lot of, high position folks in companies that I work with. So one thing is folks don't understand activism, but they want to be relevant. Like I mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of financial benefits to it as well. Like, with cancel culture and all that, like to not be canceled, I got to be involved in all of this. But all of that is very surface level. On, in June, companies change their logo, put on a rainbow background and all that. Like, what does that really do for folks? Are you changing your policies? What kind of things are you implementing to support those people? And when we say AAPI month, it's not just the AAPI folks that you enjoy, okay? It's also the queer AAPI folks, the neurodivergent AAPI folks, the sex worker AAPI folks, AAPI women, all of that. You can't pick and choose what people you want to support within that community and say that you're helping all of them.
Absolutely. Otherwise, it just feels like a cash grab.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. It's just can be very surface, and it's not any real change. And can maybe is an example of a reactive activism. Something terrible in the news happens, let's say, about any given circumstance. Unfortunately, there's far too many. And then a company makes a post but doesn't change their policy. Is that reactive activism? Is that even activism if it's just lip service?
I mean, it's virtue signaling at its finest, right? Like, it's perfectly fine to do that if you have something to support that. If you have, for example, when something awful happens, and you say like, oh, this you acknowledge it, this terrifying thing has happened. This is what our company is committed to doing to support that community. And these are the concrete action steps that we're taking, and this is what we're hoping to do. A lot of companies have these small groups or ERGs or anything like that, but what happens to them? They have no funding, they have no power, the decision makers aren't involved in that, and those ERGs like come up with something, go up to the decision makers, and they're like, we don't have the resources for this, we don't have the time for this doesn't look good for the company or whatever. So it's almost like they're throwing these folks like just a little something, a bone, but with no meat on it. And that is very, very performative.
Yeah. So what are some of the small shifts that companies can make to expand the reach of actual activism or proactive activism?
I think the first move would be to go beyond educating, because I've worked at a lot of different places, and they say, we have to educate folks on a very broad basis because everyone's at a different level, which I totally agree. Some people just have no concept and don't understand anything. However, in the past 10-15 years, in these like diversity inclusion seminars or whatever, I've been hearing the same things over and over and over again. And it seems like we're not moving forward, right? Like, oh, microaggression, like that's bad. Calling someone a racial slur is bad. Like, when are we really going to move beyond that, right? The second thing I think is putting money where your mouth is. If you say you support those people, let's take Pride for an example. Pinkwashing, that is a very real thing. Companies like create these initiatives, they get more customers and whatnot. This is a form of, and they don't actually do anything to support those communities. That's exploitation. Like you're putting those folks like on your front cover, front page or whatever, and you're not doing anything about it. That's that's literally stealing money away from those communities. And I think another thing is, excuse me, start with management, right? A lot of managers don't understand or don't have the knowledge to manage downwards, and that makes it really hard. They don't have the understanding, they don't have the experience and whatnot. Promote within, don't always hire out, right? Like, if you have folks within your company who are doing a really great job and who are part of these communities, just promote upwards, right? Don't always go out and hire. And don't ever assume anyone is ever done. I've had leaders in an organization at a director or a VP level, they say, I went to this like workshop and I took this course and I got this certificate. Anyone can do that, right? They don't really have a test at the end of that. They just make sure you sit there for X amount of hours, and they're like, "Yep, I'm an expert. I understand, Asian people now, like the API community now." Like, it's so much beyond that. Anyone can do that, but like to take concrete and action steps, that's a difficult part. And even myself and a lot of other amazing activists that I've talked to, none of us ever assume that we know everything or that we're done. It's a continuous process.
What does it look like when you work with a company? You said, I work with these companies. When you when they're like, okay, like, Karl, help us. So what do you do when you show up?
I usually go in and I evaluate. I kind of talk to them and really try to understand where they're at, right? I'm going to be super honest right now. There are some companies I know that when I go in there, they just want it to look good, to look like, oh, we had a consultant from outside, whatever. Those places, I don't really do much with them. I take their money and I'm just like, well, like, this is what I usually tell people to do, like, take it or leave it, because at the end of the day, I can advise, I can't implement, I can't force anything as an outsider, right? But there are companies who are genuinely interested and really do want to make lives better for their employees and the people that they talk to, their stakeholders and their communities. With those people, I go in and I like to talk to people from the bottom up, talking to the leaders just to quickly get a quick like umbrella of like what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it's the people who are at the bottom who are really putting in the work to make sure things are happening. So, that's what and it's honestly really simple. A lot of organizations don't do that. They don't talk to the people and they assume they know what's going on based on what they like, a fancy article that they read or anything like that. Really, like, you have the resources to do a lot of these things, utilize it, but also like fairly compensate them for it. If you want, some of your employees to work on a side project to support the community. Take other work off their plate. Don't just say, oh, you're Asian, you must want to support the API community. Here's an extra project with no extra compensation, and you still have to do all the work that you already do. Also another form of exploitation.
Yeah. So for companies that you find are actually interested in being, they're not even interested, they already are active in being socially conscious. What are, with a larger company, let's say, they're going to have a really diverse makeup, maybe amongst their workers and among their clientele. How can they decide which things to be engaged in and proactive in?
That's a really good question. I think at the like you said, like a larger company, then they would have more resources, right? There are a lot of things that I think one thing that they can do is really, first thing that I do is I send them a list of like religious observances and like, important dates for different cultures. Like I try to put as many of that on that list as possible, really looking at that, not saying one is more important than the others, but pinpoint the ones that are most relevant to your community, to the demographic, the sociographic of where you are and the folks that you serve, right? Look at that and see, I can on the list, there's like a religious, like a really important like holiday observance in like Zimbabwe or something like that, right? Like, is that really going to do anything for people that I talk to in Canada, right? What's going to make the most impact? What is going to make people realize, to help educate, to bring awareness to people?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Can you think of, or have you witnessed, or do you use some examples of some companies that are doing this really well? You don't necessarily have to give them by name, but maybe some examples of some things you've seen companies do. They're like, yes, they are actually engaged, and this is a great example of that.
Yeah, for example, on Twitter the other day, I saw, so in the States right now, there's that horrifying thing going on of folks wanting to take away, women's autonomy, bodily autonomy, and all that sort of stuff. And it's really horrifying to watch, right? A gaming company, I can't remember which one, posted about that on their Twitter. And they got a lot of backlash from their community, like the gaming community, right? Because they said, like, stick to gaming. Like, why are you doing this? We just like produce good games, and like, like if you want to change something, like just make sure women wear more clothes in your games or whatever, right? Like a lot of that kind of stuff. And I was really, really impressed with this company. They just said, if you don't like us, and just unfollow us, don't buy our games, right? We stand up for what is right, and we support women and their bodily autonomy. That's just one example of like, what's right. Technically, what does that really do, right? Like, they're just a gaming company. Their games are going to sell either way. This probably going to lessen their sales because the gaming industry is, more full of men and all that sort of stuff. But they're sticking to their stance, and I do believe they're donating a lot of money to, I'm not American, I don't know exactly what organizations they're donating to, but they're donating things to organizations that are helping with this issue, supporting women who are going through this kind of stuff, Planned Parenthood or things like that, right? So that's a really good example that I can think of recently.
Thank you for that. Can you, for maybe there's folks within the company right now that are listening in, and maybe it's a smaller company and they don't have a lot of resources. What is something that maybe they could start by doing just to move the needle forward and being a progressive force in in this proactive activism?
Yeah, I think a way of being proactive is just talking to people, right? Like we said in the very beginning, you can't really be proactive if you don't know what the issue is, if you don't know that an issue exists, right? And maybe that's just because of your experiences or the communities that or the people that you hang out with or whatever. I don't think it's anyone's fault just like to not know something, because again, how are you supposed to know if you don't know what you don't know? Which is fine, but really you have resources, you have people to talk to. Have a meeting with your employees or your coworkers or whatnot, find out what issues are affecting them. For me, when the attacks that in that attack on Asian women in Atlanta, Georgia, I believe, where a lot of women were killed, Asian women specifically, I didn't feel safe leaving my house for a couple of days because, there are people out there who want to cause harm. I talked to my manager at that time about that. I mentioned this. I said, or actually she asked me and I said, I really don't feel safe leaving the house. I prefer working at home for the next little while. Things like that, right? That is also a form of activism. That is actively protecting your employees from physical harm and protecting them mentally, their safety, their well-being. Having to take transit, every day going to work during COVID, when people are going to look at me because of the way that I look and assume that like I caused COVID or have COVID or whatever, that is also really mentally straining as well, right? Talk to your employees, find out what issues they are experiencing. If your employees aren't bringing these issues up, also look at like, how safe are you making your employees feel? How comfortable are they bringing up these issues? If nobody ever brings up anything like this or bring up things that can make them feel safer or feel better about themselves in the workplace, then really evaluate your relationship with your employees and how safe they feel speaking up.
Got to ask questions. We can't just assume, right?
Exactly.
Wow. Well, this is such a thank you for everything you were sharing so far. And we have just a couple minutes left. And if there's, this is a question, Meg asked it earlier, and I ask it every once in a while. And I'm curious to ask you, if you could go back and give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be? And that could be yesterday, that could be 2 years ago, it could be maybe before you started your business, whenever you want.
Any piece of advice.
Any piece of advice to go back and give yourself.
I think a couple years ago, I made a very conscious decision to live unapologetically. I do everything with every action I take is deliberate, and I take all action with the best intention and with all the information I have at this time, right? Ever since then, I've become, a very talkative person. I can't shut up because I want people to know what I think. It could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, but I give that advice to myself even earlier. I think only then, when you decide to actively live unapologetically, you are truly yourself, and really you get to experience things to the fullest.
That's good advice. Thank you, Karl. Okay, well, this has been so wonderful. We're going to drop it in the chat, but just for our audience, our listeners, tell us anything else we should know and how to stay connected with you.
Yeah, check out RYSE. We are a really cool community. We always do our best to help everyone, not just those within the Asian community, but everyone who is underserved or in any sort of marginalized communities. I believe it is dropped in the chat. You can check us out at RYSE.network. You can email me at Karl@RYSE.network. And again, Hunter, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that came.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Karl.
Thank you.